Alright, Path of Exile 2 is just around the corner, and being an early backer of the original, I'm excited. But there's a problem. I actually never really played the first iteration, so I'm basically gonna go in as a completely new player. And since I'm someone who likes to do some research beforehand, I did the best I could with the tools I have access to. Like you, I watched the live stream, but I also went over every single skill on POE2 DB so I could get a better understanding of what each class can do. Now, I know that technically any class can end up anywhere on the skill tree, but that thing is massive and I'm new. So I'm gonna stick to Grinding Gear Games' own classifications, and let's start with the Warrior. From what I understand, the Warrior will be a slower, heavy-hitting melee class, with the good news being that you can control your swings by repositioning your character mid-animation or even dodge roll out of them. So it does seem like GGG thought of everything and made sure we won't get stuck in annoying animation locks. When it comes to their actual skills, there's a couple of distinctions to be made. Quite a few are labeled as a slam, which I'll get to in a bit. But we also have our war cries, leaps and dashes, and even shield abilities. And the cool thing about these last ones is that a warrior shield won't just be for show, as you can use it to block nearly any attack as long as your stun meter isn't full. So basically no cheesing through fights by just raising your shield, and apparently bosses might have unblockable attacks, but those will be telegraphed by a red aura. When it comes to the shield attacks themselves, you have your basic charge, which is a staple in most games, but the other two are fairly unique. First you have Resonating Shield, which will have you bash your own shield, causing damage and debuffing your enemies, while also blocking incoming attacks at the same time. And then there's Shield Wall, where you'll ram your shield into the ground and create a wall of earth that can be destroyed to deal even more damage. But let's talk about the slams, because those have me genuinely excited, or rather their possible interactions have me excited. A great example is Earthquake, which will see you slam the ground and deal damage, while also leaving jagged ground behind that will slow enemies and can later erupt, causing an aftershock. Now, instead of having to wait for this patch of ground to erupt, you could instead plop down a Shockwave totem, which will also slam the ground and damage enemies, while also erupting Earthquake's jagged ground at the same time. I did notice that this ability specifically mentions Earthquake's jagged ground though, which does lead me to believe that Stampedes might be unaffected. I could be wrong, as again, I'm basically discovering everything for the very first time, so do let me know in the comments if you think this is gonna work differently. In the preview, we also saw another totem, but that one was a meta skill, which means that you can equip other abilities, in this case mace skills, and is gonna cast those. GGG showcased this by equipping the totem with Sunder, basically leaving behind a static ally that will cast that ability. So I kinda wanna try this out with abilities that either trigger aftershocks or maybe can even create fissures, which is yet another AoE that warriors can leave behind that will interact with some of their other skills. Abilities like Earth Shatter and Volcanic Fissure will create them, and as you can see from the latter, they can cause additional aftershocks if you hit them with another slam. Earth Shatter also has a second interaction, by the way, as it's gonna leave behind a spike at the end of its fissure that can be shattered with either another slam or with a war cry. And currently there's two that I know of. One that will taunt enemies and empower attacks while combusting them on death, while the other one is gonna taunt them and knock them back, and if a heavily stunned one is hit, then our next slam will cause yet another aftershock. Which brings me to an important mechanic that's gonna be relevant for all classes, which is Poise. Quite a few of the warrior abilities have the potential to stun enemies. Now, some elites or bosses might initially be resistant to being crowd controlled though, but as you build up Poise, they too will eventually be stunned. This does come with the flip side that a recently crowd-controlled enemy will most likely be resistant, so I guess we gotta make the most of that window whenever it occurs. Now, that covers most of the warrior abilities, but there's actually more, because every class will have two ascendancies that can be unlocked through trials in Acts 2 and 3, which will further emphasize some of the class's strengths. For the warrior, that means eventually unlocking the Titan or the Warbringer. The former will significantly buff your slams, cause your hits to be crushing blows and deal more damage to stunned enemies, as well as boosting your own HP and armor. Oh, and you also get to equip an extra chest with 20 inventory slots. The Warbringer focuses on defense as well, but in a completely different way, as Jade Heritage will reportedly grant you temporary invulnerability for a short amount of time, so you're gonna want to control the flow of combat a bit more with that one. This ascendancy further also boosts your totems and your war cries, with the latter letting you explode corpses in your presence and even sometimes have no cooldown at all, although I would assume that this is only for a short time though. Then there's the boost to the totems, which will let you trigger ancestral spirits, but at this point we don't actually know what that means yet. If all of this brute force isn't really your thing and you consider yourself to be a bit more of an intellectual, you get to pick from two schools of magic. Either you control the elements as a sorceress, or you choose dark magic as a witch. As mentioned, the Sorceress is all about the elements, and you'll be able to burn foes with fire, shock them with lightning, or freeze them with, well, cold abilities. Like warriors and their totems, sorceresses, and I know that sounds wrong, but it's the actual plural of the word, have balls. I mean orbs, which basically creates an object that pulses damage and or debuffs nearby enemies, and those can be interacted with as well. Take Solar Orb for example, which creates a stationary fire orb that explodes and deals damage while also burning the closest targets, but you can then also target it with a Flame Blast ability to cause an even bigger explosion. A sorceress can also freeze their enemies and even buff themselves with spells like Hypothermia to improve those spells' effects. Once frozen, you can of course shatter them with a spell like Cold Snap, but that spell can also be used to detonate Frostbolt, which normally would explode whenever it hits terrain. But that again is not the only spell that is gonna interact with Frostbolt, as Ice Nova, which normally expands ice from you and knocks enemies back, can also be used on Frostbolt so that the Nova expands from there instead. Like the Monk and maybe other classes, they have an ability that can cull enemies, or in other words, finish them off if they have low enough HP. And you get it by now. But Lightning Warp also interacts with other abilities, so you can get more teleportations out of it to cull more enemies. Now, everything so far has been about burning, shocking or freezing, and the meta abilities further hone in on those, as you can get 3 cast on abilities, 1 for each element, which will build up energy to then trigger all socketed spells once you hit the maximum. So the name of the game seems to be dealing massive amounts of elemental damage, debuffing the enemies as soon as possible, building up that energy to then destroy anything in front of you. One skill I've neglected thus far is Temporal Chains, which is a curse that lowers enemies' action speed and makes other effects on them expire more slowly. And that's because I wanted to keep it as a segue into the Ascendancies, because a Sorceress can become a Chronomancer and literally stop time, rewind it to restore health and mana, and even snap back their position to restore cooldowns. And if manipulating time isn't so much your thing, you could instead further enhance your elemental abilities by summoning an elemental storm every time you land a crit. You can also shock your enemies twice, which might have cool interactions with the cast on shock meta ability, and while you're at it, you can cause about every single ability to apply shock to your enemies. Now, if you'd rather deal in dark magic, then the Witch might be more of your thing, as she's gonna focus mainly on minions, curses and shooting bone shards. I haven't talked about yet another new mechanic called Spirit, which is gonna help you upkeep or auto-cast certain abilities, and it's actually relevant for every single class. The Sorceress, for example, can use Spirit to maintain their elemental armor, and for the Witch it can be used to automatically resummon her minions, which all in all is a very nice quality of life addition that will prevent us from needlessly mashing certain abilities that don't really add to the gameplay. There are a ton of minions to pick from, by the way, and I would do the developers an injustice if I didn't discuss all of them, because there's an incredible amount of interactions possible between them and even some of your non-minion abilities. First you have your basic warriors, as well as the more hard-hitting brutes that can stun enemies, and reavers that can enrage on command, because yes, summons have their own active command skills as well, which in this case causes them to lose life over time and gain rage on hit. Then there's the more specialized long-range minions, with a sniper who can fire a poison gas arrow that will create a poisonous cloud that can be set on fire. This you can either do by literally setting it on fire, or by hitting it with a detonator skill, which the Arsonist brings, as they can detonate any minion whose life is below a certain threshold. But that's still not all, because we also have the Storm Mage, which will summon a lightning storm on command, and if that isn't enough, it's gonna create shocked ground near any skeleton that has already fallen. And then there's the Cleric, who quite simply will heal other minions and revive fallen skeletons. Now, this is gonna sound crazy, but these are the more basic summons, because there's also Bone and Pain Offering, which will both impale a skeleton on a spike, and as long as it remains active, they'll either protect minions from hits or cause them to use their abilities more quickly. The insane thing is that these are minions themselves, so Bone Spike will actually protect Bone Spike, if you will. And that's still not all, because Bind Spectre will allow you to capture a spirit of a defeated monster, allowing you to summon them as your own minion. And I really hope that these retain the abilities of their NPC versions, because that too might make for some very interesting combos. With all of this excitement, I almost forgot about the fact that you can also summon a zombie, or even a minion that will bolster your own energy shield as long as it's active. And that's only the minion part, because we still have curses to cover as well, which will all debuff your enemies in some sort of way, be it lowering armor, resistances or damage. And if you have no need for them anymore, you can simply exploit them to deal more damage. Cursing every single enemy will get tedious though, and again, the devs came with an incredible solution, as Blasphemy is a persistent AoE that's gonna combine all of your socketed curses into an aura that applies their effects all around you. Apart from these, witches also have abilities that deal damage more directly. I've already mentioned they can shoot various bone shards, but they also have a couple that will inflict chaos damage. And Contagion is a pretty fun example of those, as it's not only gonna deal chaos damage over time, but will also infect any other enemy if the original one dies. And here's the kicker. If you reanimate or detonate a corpse affected by this spell, those will continue spreading Contagion as well. To me, it's hard not to get excited over the Witch, and we haven't even covered the specializations yet, which will both create life force for power in their very own way. First we have the Blood Mage, whose spells will not only cost mana, but also life, and in return for that you get harder hitting critical hits. You can of course also boost your life force through various passives and regain some thanks to the Life Leech passive, as well as their ability that lets them pick up healing orbs. And that's gonna bring us to our craziest ascendancy so far, the Infernalist, who will trade their mana for Infernal Flame, and instead of spending this resource, you will gain some every time you would have spent mana. At maximum Infernal Flame, you're gonna start taking damage, which admittedly is bad, but any ability cast above 30 will also cause you to ignite your enemies, so you're basically gonna be spending time balancing the resource to deal more damage, while trying to make sure you don't die yourself. And that's not even the coolest part, because an Infernalist can transform into a literal demon, which will cause them to take increasing amounts of damage, but also improves their casting speed. And if that wasn't enough, they also get a pet Hellhound that will help them absorb damage. 3 down, 3 to go. And the Ranger will be our last pure class, as we'll take a look at the 2 hybrids after. The Ranger is pretty much what you would expect, a bow-wielding class that focuses on mobility, and they do mean that literally in this game, as you can keep firing off your skills while still moving around. Like the Sorceress, the Ranger focuses on elemental damage, as they have lightning-themed arrows that will shock their enemies, icy arrows that can freeze, and like our skeletal arsonists, poison arrows that can create a cloud which can be detonated to burn their enemies. Now, while this is a more basic archetype, GGG managed once again to up the creativity though. Tornado Shot, for example, creates a tornado that deals physical damage over time and hinders enemies standing inside, but you can then also attack the tornado yourself, which will cause it to spit out a nova of the matching projectiles. Then there's also Lightning Rod, which will leave an arrow in the ground to which you can chain other lightning beams. And quite a few of the Ranger's non-elemental arrow attacks are impacted by Frenzy, which you can build up and then consume to repeat attacks with Barrage or fire extra projectiles with Rain of Arrows. Their ascendancies hone in even more on their mobility and their ability to deal damage at range. And of the two, the Deadeye is maybe the more basic one, as they will lose their accuracy penalty at a distance, meaning you don't have to spend any passive points on accuracy. On top of that, you also get an action speed bonus, which buffs both your movement and your attack speed when you use any skill, but you will lose this whenever you do get hit. And then there's also the fact that you will fire an additional projectile with each of your abilities. Their second ascendancy is a bit of a bizarre one, as they can use their flask charges to throw concoctions instead. I did notice that on Max Roll they mentioned that while there's only 2 so far, the Bleeding and the Fulminating concoction, it might be possible that more elements will be added later on. Throwing their own flasks isn't the only thing Pathfinders are good at though, as they get less of a movement speed penalty while attacking, or can apparently even remove it completely. And the Pathfinder also specializes in dealing poison damage, as they can spread their most damaging one from a target that just died. Now apparently there is a base limit of 1 poison stack per enemy, but this can be increased through various items, as well as their own overwhelming toxicity trait, which already doubles the number they can inflict. By the way, if you're at this point so lost in the sauce and you have no clue what class or ascendancy to go for first, you better brace yourself, because it's about to get a whole lot worse. The first hybrid we're gonna take a look at is the Mercenary, who gets a crossbow which they can turn into a shotgun, a sniper rifle, an assault rifle, or like the Ranger, fire elemental bolts with. There's a bit of a twist to this firing projectiles mechanic though, as they can load cartridges that will allow them to shoot a certain amount of bolts before having to reload. In their trailer, Grinding Gear Games gave a couple of examples of how these can interact with each other, like using fragmentation rounds to explode a wall of ice they just created with Glacial Bolt, or using explosive shots to detonate a gas grenade, similar to how Rangers and Witches can detonate their own poison clouds. There currently are 4 more grenades listed on POE2 DB, and most of them do what you'd expect them to, except maybe for the flash grenade, which apparently not only blinds enemies, but also your own allies. Apart from the typical interactions, like setting the oil grenade's field on fire with explosive shot, you can also fire off rapid shot to build heat, which will then buff your grenade's damage. Now, with their ascendancies, mercenaries can turn into witchhunters to get extra bonuses against undead and demons. But regardless of those, they seem to be an excellent option for clearing maps quickly with their ability that can make enemies explode on kill, as well as take care of bosses with their ability to deal 30% of their maximum HP as damage on the first hit. They also have a rather unique take on defense, as their enemies will gain concentration, which can be broken and will make them unable to attack. So if a boss is pestering you with its abilities, you might have an easier time that way as well. Their second ascendancy is straight up weird, but I can see the Gemling Legionnaire work pretty well if you have the gear and some experience with the game, as you can get more out of your gems, ignore some of their stat requirements, and even get 3 additional skill slots. As a new player, I'm not sure if I can squeeze the most out of these bonuses, but I'm sure that some of you veterans can multiply these benefits into a crazy strong build. And that brings us to our 6th and final class, the Monk, which coincidentally has one of the coolest ascendancies, but let's first cover the basics. Monks either wield quarterstaves or inflict damage with their bare hands, and them being an int dex hybrid, they took some inspiration from both the Ranger and the Sorceress, as they get to manipulate lightning, ice and wind. Quite a few of their abilities have a movement component tied to them, making them rather mobile, and like any other class we already discussed, can be chained together. Take Siphoning Strike for example, which can consume shock on a target to create a shockwave, which will then also grant them a power charge that can be consumed with Falling Thunder to fire projectiles on top of its original effect. I already talked about killing enemies when discussing the Sorceress's Lightning Warp, and well, monks get to do this with their Killing Palm ability, which is one of 3 palm abilities we already know about. The other 2 will either stun an enemy and grant you a buff that will cause your attacks to fire projectiles, or more interestingly, attach a chunk of ice to your target, which can be exploded if it takes enough damage. Like the Stormweaver, they can further focus on their elemental attacks with the Invoker ascendancy, and even fully specialize into either lightning or cold damage. Now, instead of triggering elemental storms, they'll trigger elemental blasts when landing melee critical hits. And to top it all off, they can also turn into an unbound avatar by stacking ailments, which will make them deal even more damage and inflict even more ailments. And that brings us to our final and one of the coolest ascendancies, the Acolyte of Chayula, which lets them quite literally embrace the darkness and replaces their spirit with, well, darkness, which will start at a base 100 and increases for each level gained. Now, instead of losing life or energy shields, they will reserve 1 darkness, which will essentially protect their own HP. Unreserved darkness isn't wasted either though, as that can be turned into quite a considerable damage boost. The Acolyte has a couple of other defensive quirks as well, like a trait that will prevent their energy shield from recharging naturally, which they can instead replenish with Mana Leech through one of their other passives. Unlike the Invoker, they can't transform into anything else, but they do get to see into the domain of the Breach Demons, where they can pick up the Flames of Chayula, which will restore their HP, mana and grants them damage bonuses. And that's all of them. I didn't talk about every single skill that is currently listed on the various resources, but I will post links to the websites in the description of the video. Again, I'm coming at this as a complete noob, so there's probably tons of stuff I missed or abilities that might not turn out to be on that. But the ones I discussed are the ones that caught my attention. Now, I'd also love to hear from more experienced players what they think about the 6 current options though. I personally am leaning towards either trying out a witch or a monk, but I would be lying if I said if I didn't care for the other 4. So here's to testing a ton of builds in the upcoming early access, I guess. Now, if you could do me a real solid and like the video and subscribe to the channel. I recently swapped off of Guild Wars 2 and I've been looking for a new game to know live. I dove headfirst into Diablo, but seeing what this game's endgame has to offer, I think I might be stuck in Rayclast for a very long time. And if you'd like to see me struggle my way through the game for the first time, go follow me on Twitch, because I'll be sure to stream all of my progress once the early access goes live.